Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 1 of Window on Mount Zion. The Pope's visit. It was January 1964. The Pope had announced his intention of visiting the holy places in Israel. We were at that time planning the rebuilding of the house. Mount Zion is sacred, not only to Jews, but also to Christians. Here, according to tradition, is the upper room, where Jesus and his disciples gathered to celebrate the Last Supper. Here, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is said to have fallen into her final sleep. With the announcement of the Pope's intended visit, work immediately began on the road leading to Mount Zion. After a few weeks of concentrated activity, the rough military track was transformed into a smooth asphalted road, leading to a large open space which had been cleared and surfaced to provide parking space for many cars. I called it the Pope's parking lot. Here you can see the road leading up around the side of Mount Zion, and if you look at the aerial view again, that's the road that you can see in the foreground winding around. And if you look going up halfway on the right-hand side, you can see the Pope's parking lot, which is a clearing on the left-hand side of the road. So that was the Pope's parking lot. And if you look directly to the left of it, there's one little red roof building, but it's not the small one, it's the one above it. There's a slightly bigger red roof building, and that is the house which the Roses rebuilt and is still there on Mount Zion today. But there you can get a clear view of the Pope's parking lot and the road leading up to it, which has since been improved, but at the time it was a wonderful little road for Pauline and Albert to drive up on in their car. Now, immediately behind the yellow signboard marking the frontier, which stood on the east side of the square, a high, ugly, corrugated iron fence was erected to protect the Pope and his entourage and to define the Jordanian border clearly. The road continued from the Pope's parking lot the last few yards up the hill to the top of the mount where Obadiah's little garden had once flourished. It had been turned into another parking lot. So that parking lot she's talking about now would have just been up the hill on the other side of their house that you can see there. And that was a smaller parking lot which would have given access to the upper room building where King David's tomb is. So that had just Obadiah's little garden had been turned into another parking lot. The life-giving earth had been sealed off and suffocated with asphalt. The moment I saw it, I recalled the pleasure and pride with which Obadiah had shown me the few flowers he had coaxed out of the stony soil. I shared the anguish he must have felt as he watched the iron teeth of the bulldozer crush and devour the precious blooms he had nourished in order to beautify one tiny corner of Mount Zion. This parking area in front of the house I named Garden Square. The barrier was once more lowered and locked, closing off the new road, and preparations for the Pope's arrival continued. Hundreds of security men lined the road approaching the mount. In fact, they lined the entire route from Megiddo, where early that morning the Pope had entered Israel from Jordan. After visiting the holy places around the Sea of Galilee and Nazareth, he traveled the long journey back to the Israeli side of Jerusalem. Security men were also concealed on every part of Mount Zion, since Israel was greatly concerned with the Pope's safety. No private individual was allowed within the precincts of the mount that night. I awaited the Pope's arrival in an observation post on an opposite hill. It was a bitterly cold night. The hour scheduled for his arrival had long passed. The wind was biting. A sudden movement along the lines of security men revived the atmosphere of expectancy, and then the headlamps of police motorcycles and cars appeared in the distance, traveling into the valley at the foot of Mount Zion. There they passed through the raised barrier, and I watched the Pope and his entourage drive up the new road, temporarily illuminated by many floodlights. Cars filled the floodlit parking places as the great father of the Catholic Church and his companions alighted from their car in Garden Square and walked through the small gate on the way past King David's tomb to the upper room. The pigeons nesting in the room overlooking the parked cars were startled by the lights and the noise which broke the customary night silence on Mount Zion. The following week, with the new key, I unlocked the new padlock which had been fitted to the barrier by the police. As our cars sped smoothly up the newly made road, I was grateful to the Pope. Now, after endless difficulties and opposition, work had at last begun on the reconstruction of the house. The pigeons, so long used to it as their home, were eventually persuaded by the faithful Obadiah to transfer their home to the roof of a nearby building. The talk of reconstructing the house was completed in 6 months. The ordinary problems of building were increased because of the house's location. Frequent incidents on Israel's borders often necessitated the closing of the road, even to ourselves, and this interrupted the work. Each morning, I had to meet the workmen and open the barrier for them, and each afternoon the ceremony was reversed. All building supplies were similarly brought in at prearranged times so that I would know when to be waiting at the barrier. "How did you manage to get the work done so quickly?" asked a friend. The workmen did not feel very safe here and were anxious to complete their job as quickly as possible, I replied. They worked at twice the normal speed. Dr. Kahani visited us several times to see the progress we had made. On one occasion, he looked through a broken window to see the heads of the nearby Arab soldiers above their sandbags, glanced around the room at the 8 large windows, and said, "You must get bulletproof glass for all the windows, otherwise you will not be safe." "We shan't need it," I replied. He looked at me searchingly, as though not quite sure of my meaning. "I'd feel better about you being here if you did this," he said as he left. But our windows were repaired with ordinary glass and were held in place by our faith. I began to think of the need for a telephone. This was a great problem, as it meant a new line to Mount Zion. The telephone department was not prepared to give it to us, even with the recommendation of the Mount Zion Committee. What were we to do? We decided to seek the help of a doctor friend, whom we had not seen for some years. He greeted us warmly. "You both look very well," he said. "What can I do for you?" "We are fine at present," I replied, "but we want your help concerning our well-being. We are moving to another house, and since it is in rather an isolated place, we feel it is essential to have a phone." "Why come to me?" he asked. "Well, supposing we need you at any time, how would we be able to contact you?" With a friendly smile, he took up his pen. "I'll try to help," he said. "Where is the house?" On Mount Zion." "At what address do you want the phone?" he asked. Mount Zion." He became a little impatient. "I have no time to waste on jokes," he said. "If you want my help, tell me where you want your phone." Mount Zion." He put down his pen, sat back in his chair, and gave me a long look. I answered his unspoken question. "Yes, we're going to live on Mount Zion, right at the top, not many yards from the border. Another silence. Then he said, "I certify you both as completely crazy." He took up his pen again and wrote, and some weeks later we had a phone. Our first night and day. In August 1967, the day arrived when we could occupy the house. Its war scars were healed. Lights shone again from its windows. My husband and I moved in and gave it the name Ha-Ohel, the tent. We chose this name with the prayer that the spirit of Abraham's tent would abide in it, making it a place where all people who came could find a loving welcome, a meal, a bed, rest, or renewal of the spirit according to their needs. Every day, all over the world, Jews pray, "O cause a new light to shine upon Zion, and may we all be worthy soon to enjoy its brightness." We prayed that same ray of this new light might shine in the home and garden we were making on Mount Zion. The last glow of an August sunset was disappearing from the sky as I looked out of my window on our first evening on Mount Zion. The radiance of the stars increased their light in the moonless sky. They were like tiny lighted windows in the sky. On the opposite hill, occasional faint lights could be seen in the little houses of the village of Silwan. The Mount of Olives was marked only by the artificial lights outlining the arched windows of the Intercontinental Hotel. I drew the curtains and switched on the lights. For the first time since 1948, the building on Mount Zion, so near the border, was occupied by civilians. I was conscious of the interest it aroused and had the unpleasant feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Apart from the soldiers at the military post and the priests of the Dormition Abbey, we were quite alone on Mount Zion. Before retiring for the night, I had to take Tamar, our little wire-haired terrier, out for her walk. I put on her lead, and before we left the lighted room, went out into the darkness. I almost slipped over some stones being used to build up the entrance to the house. There was not a flicker of light to be seen anywhere, and not a sound to be heard. The darkness, which seemed darker than night, was sinister and hid unpleasant surprises, making familiar places unfamiliar. I was not permitted to use a torch, a flashlight. It would have been dangerous. Tamar pulled at her lead, searching in this unaccustomed place for a guiding smell. I hoped she would find it quickly. Suddenly, in the darkness, I heard a rushing movement coming towards us. I grabbed Tamar in my arms. As several live, panting bodies leapt on us, Tamar yelped in fear. A pack of large wild dogs nearly knocked me over as they sniffed contemptuously at Tamar and then passed by on their way. Both Tamar and I were a little shaky as we returned with relief to the protection of the house. I locked the doors securely behind us. Before going to bed, I opened my Bible and read, "The Lord will create upon every dwelling place on Mount Zion a cloud by day and the shining of a flaming fire by night." Comforted by the protection of this promise, I fell asleep. Soon, however, I was awakened by the mournful howling of a jackal. I lay awake listening. The animal passed beneath my window and away into the distance. Then I heard footsteps, human footsteps. I remembered the warning of the commander of the military post that there would be patrols on night duty. The footsteps receded, and again I slept, this time to be awakened by the sound of motor vehicles arriving at the military post. Mingled with these sounds were those of men's voices, soldiers speaking to each other as they carried out their duties in the darkness of the night. After a while, the rumbling of the departing vehicles trailed off into silence. All was quiet again, until a loud barking of dogs filled the air. They came across the border from Jordan in large numbers, passing the house on their nocturnal adventures. It was that mysterious hour before the dawn, when night prepares to depart in silence, as a new day is about to be born. The chanting of a man's deep, strong voice broke into the stillness. The muezzin from the top of the minaret across the border was calling his Muslim brethren to prayer, a call to draw the slumbering soul back to consciousness and awareness that his Maker had made him the gift of another day, for which he must give thanks. The first faint ray of morning light dimly outlined my curtained window. Our first night on Mount Zion had ended. Some minutes later I drew the curtains and looked through the window, welcoming the new day. I looked down at the Pope's parking lot on the border. On the other side of the fence I saw the heads of the Jordanian soldiers above the sandbags. Behind the hills of Moab, a red-gold light washed across the sky with the approach of day. The color deepened as the sun appeared on the horizon, lighting the heavens and earth with its powerful rays. The evening and the morning now of our first day. The sun had already risen above the horizon when I left my room, and Albert was reading the morning prayers. I descended the stone staircase and crossed the spacious entrance hall, where the early morning sun shone through low arched windows. As I passed through the front entrance, I saw the mezuzah containing the scroll of the law nailed to its doorpost, and I thanked God again for his Torah and his light, and for this first new day on Mount Zion. I walked through the gate which opened onto Garden Square. There was not a soul about, only the pigeons and the doves on the rooftops. There was a silence and peace which belonged specifically to Mount Zion, an atmosphere heavy with memories of the past and hallowed by the prayers of centuries. The silence lingered as the shadows shortened in the sunlit square. Suddenly I heard a voice in prayer, and I looked up. A solitary figure stood high on the roof above King David's tomb, facing the temple site. He poured out his soul in praise and petition to the Holy One of Israel. The locked doors of the little museums and the Chamber of Destruction, which is a memorial of the Holocaust on Mount Zion, were waiting to be opened. Also the small gate leading to David's tomb. Footsteps were coming across from that direction. A key turned and the small iron gate opened. The pigeons flew down from the roof into the square. They knew these footsteps belonged to Ovadia, who brought them their food and water each morning. Later, the little band of Mount Zion's workers came through the small iron gate. There was Abraham with his large broom, who began sweeping and tidying the square and its surroundings. The little museum, with its model of our lost temple, opened its doors. Rabbis, guides, and caretakers entered the unlocked door of the Chamber of Destruction, the Holocaust Museum, where grim reminders of Jewry's dark night and the unspeakable suffering of its people can be seen. Among them are the ashes of these martyrs brought to rest on Mount Zion beside King David. In the middle of the morning, I heard a voice proclaiming, "You are now standing on holy Mount Zion." Outside the house, a group of American tourists were gathered around their guide, listening intently to his opening remarks. He pointed to the iron fence some yards below. "That," he said, "is the Jordanian border. All you see beyond that is Jordan. Those soldiers you see behind the sandbags on the rooftops are Arabs." Some of the women exchanged anxious glances. One said, "Let's go back. This is a little too near the border for me." Another, pointing to our house, asked, "Is this another museum?" "No," the guide replied. "I think it is a private home." "People live here?" she explained in astonishment. "They must be crazy." The tourists hurriedly returned their cameras to their cases and walked back, seeking other scenes of interest. The doorbell rang. Through the window on the upper floor, I saw a stranger standing at the gate, the first visitor to Ha'ohel. I went down to open the gate. "Shalom," I said, and invited him into the house. The youthfulness of his shining blue eyes and smooth pink cheeks was belied by his long white beard. His pockets were bulging, and out of one of them he took a small, well-worn Bible. He read from the Psalm of David, "Lord, who shall dwell in thy holy hill?" Smiling, he said, "You see, I had to come and find out who could be living here." "How did you know we were here?" I asked. "I come to Mount Zion every day to pray." "Today I heard that you had moved in." "You come to pray on Mount Zion every day?" I asked, amazed. "It is the will of the Creator," he answered, and again opened the pages of his Bible and read, "Exalt ye the Lord our God, and worship at his holy hill." I realized that this was the man whose voice I'd heard in prayer earlier in the morning on the roof of King David's tomb. Albert then entered the room, looking inquiringly at the bearded stranger. "I am Yaakov," he said, extending his hand to Albert. "You must have done many mitzvot, good deeds, in your life, for the Creator to allow you to live here." "No deeds that I have ever done could make me worthy to live on Mount Zion," replied Albert. Yaakov read another appropriate passage from his Bible. We were to realize, when we came to know him better, that the Bibles, both English and Hebrew, that he carried around in his bulging pockets, were constantly referred to. They provided him with the answer to any question, any problem, his own or someone else's. His erudition was impressive. Always he unerringly turned to the relevant chapter and the appropriate verse. "Come again," I said to him as he prepared to leave. "You are always welcome. Perhaps you would like to join us on the Sabbath, on Shabbat." He smiled graciously but non-committedly. "If the Creator wills," he said as he descended the stairs. After our strange visitor had departed, I went outside and walked around the house. I was searching. Where could I make the garden on Mount Zion? Piles of stones, rubble, remnants of walls, and demolished buildings confronted me. But I thought, how many times had the stones of Jerusalem been cast down into the dust and lifted up again? How often had the city of David been destroyed and rebuilt? How like the people of Israel were these stones, indestructible. They were shaken out of their places, cast into the dust, broken and scattered, but never destroyed, always used again by the master builder for still greater glory. The stones of Jerusalem bear silent witness to the glory of the temple. They had walled the city and made homes for its people. Now they lay waiting for the return of the people. Some of these ancient Jerusalem stones were mixed with untidy heaps of rubble around the house. The dust could not hide their warm glow, rose-colored like a blush at sunrise and golden with light at sunset. The story of Nehemiah's entry into Jerusalem to rebuild the fallen walls of the city came to my mind. He saw the destruction, and he said to the few men with him, "Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem." And they responded, "Let us rise up and build." Then said Nehemiah, "The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we, his servants, will arise and build." I was encouraged by these thoughts. We too would rise up and build. With the faith of Nehemiah, we would clear the rubble and use the fallen stones to repair the wall around the garden. Suddenly I had a vision. Roses, lilies, and myriads of colored blooms raised their heads where the stones and dust were piled. Young trees spread blossomed branches in the fragrant air. We will arise and build, echoed in my heart as I return to my duties in the house.